To ground ourselves with the facts, let's talk about the current federal government shutdown. On October 1st, 2025, the federal government entered a funding lapse because Congress failed to enact the 12 appropriations bills or the continuing resolution required to finance the operations of the United States government of the fiscal year. As a result of the lapse, many federal agencies have ceased non essential discretionary functions. Many federal employees have been furloughed, and others deemed essential are working without pay. Key programs and services are under strain: food assistance programs, national parks, regulatory activity and research facilities, and more. The institutional backdrop: the federal budget process requires Congress to pass appropriations bills by September 30th each year. If not, it typically resorts to a continuing resolution to keep the government open. The shutdown is no isolated incident. The United States has seen multiple shutdowns historically, often tied to partisan standoffs over spending policy riders or constitutional questions of budget authority. The shutdown is no isolated incident. Thus, the government is shut down because of the funding ended. Service has been disrupted, and the pressure is mounting across the country. The two sides, what Republicans are arguing. Let us turn first to the arguments advanced by the Republican side. First of all, the fiscal restraint. One major theme from Republicans is the need to restrain federal spending, reduce waste and fraud, and ensure the taxpayer dollars are used efficiently. The White House and the GOP leadership have repeatedly emphasized savings, cutting unnecessary programs, and holding the line on excessive discretionary spending. For example, in the lead up to the shutdown, the administration signaled it would use the lapse in funding as an opportunity to clear out deadwood waste and fraud in government. Fundamentally, the argument is if the government can't afford to keep spending at current levels without risks of structural imbalance, then the appropriations process and the oversight need to be stricter. The policies and priorities, the leverage that they would have. Republicans argue the funding would reflect the policy priorities, for example, stronger border and security spending, some adjustments in healthcare spending, defense, and so on. They resist providing open ended or blanketed extensions of programs without oversight or reform. They also argue the passing of a clean continuing resolution, one that extends funding at current levels without additional policy riders. And this prudent approach to the government can reopen, and then further policy work, which is often more continuous, can be addressed separately. For example, GOP leaders say the Democrats should accept a funding deal without additional mandates and one then negotiate the broader policy items. Now, the responsibility and accountability. From the GOP's perspective, they say they have passed a funding measure in the House to keep government running until later, in this case until mid-November, in a place of one's on the onus on the Democrats to vote it through. They argue that continuing delays reflect Democratic obstruction rather than the GOP's insurgence. They caution that continued shutdowns undermine government functioning, hurting the economy, and that ideally both parties should compromise. But they also maintain they will not pay ransom for policies they disagree with. Keep spending under control. Keep spending under control, use a clean funding extension to reopen the government, and then deal with the policy changes, but without reopening the dysfunction persists. The Democrats are arguing that the funding bills being offered or continuing resolution proposals are inadequate because they fail to extend the important benefits and safeguards, especially healthcare subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, Medicaid protections, and aid to low-income Americans. They assert that certain funding proposals risk cutting and rescinding programs that Americans rely on for health care, nutrition, including the SNAP, education, so on and so forth. The view is that reopening the government without addressing the protections means that vulnerable Americans will continue to face risk. Democrats counted that the shutdown moment is being used by Republicans as leverage to force policy changes, spending cuts under programs without negotiation. They believe they must hold firm to get meaningful concessions. For example, they are demanding renewal of the ACA subsidies to prevent premiums from rising dramatically. They argue that passing a continuing resolution that simply extends current funding levels without dealing with underlying policy issues, healthcare, taxes, is insufficient, and two kicks that can end up being kicked down the road till be a further problem. Reopening the government, yes, but only in a way that protects critical programs, prevents cuts to vulnerable Americans, and includes meaningful policy reform rather than just a temporary funding patch. Now, my problem with this is they want to give Medicaid and funding to illegal immigrants instead of hardworking Americans that the taxpayers pay for, and they just want us to hand it to the illegals that came across the border. And that I don't agree with. The human and economic costs of the shutdown. Before proposing solutions, it's worth reflecting on the real world costs of shutdowns, which underpin the matter so much. Administrative and operational disruptions. Agencies have suspended non essential operations. For example, regulatory oversight, scientific research, environmental cleanup, and more have been hit. Federal employees impacted. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers are furloughed or are working without pay. States and municipalities feel the ripple effect. The economic effect, experts estimate the longer the shutdown lasts, the more harm the economic growth. Signals to the public and markets. Shutdowns undermine confidence in government capacity to function, raise uncertainty for businesses, and complicit long-term planning for contractors and agencies. In short, the shutdown is not just a political stunt, it's a tangible cost for people, for services, for the economy, and for governance. Given the position of both parties, what would it take, realistically, to reopen the government and do so in a way that addresses concerns for both Republicans and Democrats? I outlined several elements that could form a pathway forward. Short term funding, a bridge of continuous resolution. First and foremost, Congress must pass a continuing resolution of an omnibus appropriations bill to provide funding and reopen the government. As many overseers point out, the sooner this is done, the better. For Republicans, this could be a clean CR extending current funding levels to defined period through November and December to get the government back online. For Democrats, the CR should include assurance that key programs like the ACA subsidies, SNAP, Medicaid protections will not subject immediate cuts to elimination during the bridge period. To satisfy the Democrats' concerns, the funding package should include a limited set of policy readers, assurances for immediate rollback of Medicaid eligibility. For Republicans to protect their interests, the package could include commitment to review the spending programs, waste fraud, and promise that future appropriations will prioritize spending restraints. Both sides benefit if there is a clear roadmap. Once the government is reopened, Congress commits to passing full-year appropriations bills for each agency of an omnibus by a date certain, for example, the remainder of the fiscal year. Simultaneously, the parties agree to launch negotiations on the major policy disputes: healthcare, border security, tax reform, social spending. They might agree to convene a bipartisan committee or conference process with deadlines. By setting a timeline, both sides have accountability. Republicans know the policy fight doesn't happen indefinitely. Democrats know funding doesn't get kicked down the road without protections. To further satisfy Republicans' concerns about spending oversight, the agreement could include provisions for an audit, review, or target spending scrutiny of agencies and programs. For Democrats' part, they may insist on safeguarding that the government does not use the shutdown as leverage to force massive cuts without negotiations. A balanced oversight framework helps build trust. Now, just a little bit ago, we've seen a Democrat on live TV talk about how they got to take advantage of the leverage they've been given, even though it hurts the American people. So the Democrats really ain't caring about the struggle of the American people. They want what they want so they can give illegals everything that they don't deserve. And that's wrong, and we should all deny that, or we should all be against that. To get by on both sides, the bridge to CR might be mostly clean. No broad policy readers, but it should accompany a formal memorandum of understanding or a side letter that commits both parties to the timeline and process described above. This helps Republicans argue they have reopened government without capitulating on policy today, and help Democrats argue they secured meaningful policy protections and a roadmap to adapt deeper structural issues. Both sides must signal to the American people that it is not business as usual, that they will honor the commitments respecting the timeline and hold each other accountable. Federal employees and contractors must be paid, and states and communities must be assured the programs of SNAP, WIC, and the VA services will resume fully. For example, multiple states have already sued the administration over a freeze of food stamps. A shutdown resolution should come with a public statement of responsibility, a recognition of the cost, and the need to restore confidence to the government. Let's be candid. While the pathway above is reasonable, there are frictions, points, risks, and even failures. Deep distrust. Each side suspects others acting in bad faith. Republicans may fear that protections become permanent spending commitments. Democrats may fear that the clean CR becomes a blank check to force future cuts. The political trust is eroded. Timeline comparisons, full appropriations may be unrealistic if deadlines slip. The same cycle of crisis may repeat next year, and some analysts warn that ending the immediate shutdown does not end the underlying crisis of the process. Advocacy groups, voter expectations, interest groups will press their sides to hold firm. Members of Congress may face pressure from their base to not give in, making compromise politics risky. Some of the policy disputes are large: healthcare, taxes, border security, and may not lend themselves to a quick solution. And the full year appropriations bill become hostage to those policies, you risk repeating the shutdown. Why does it matter that we get this right? Lives and services of veterans, low income families, students, researchers, and contractors, as well as federal employees, all face uncertainty and disruption when the government is not functional. A prolonged shutdown slows growth, undermines investment, and reduces consumer business confidence. Even short terms carries a cost. The federal government is the backbone of many critical services, which disaster response, air traffic control, public health, scientific research of national defense. Repeated shutdown erodes the competence and the public's trust, which we get delays in airplanes, food stamps being taken away from people because the government's not open, so on and so forth. Future generations, if each year becomes a tug of war and ends in a shutdown, then the budget process becomes unresolved. Policy becomes stranded, and the long term structural issues like debt, entitlement reform, agency modernization remain unaddressed. What Congress must do and what we as citizens can expect: immediate action to pass the bridge continuing resolution today. Get federal workers paid, restore the services, reassure the publics and the states. Set a clear schedule, full appropriations bills by December 31st or another realistic date. Policy negotiations, timeline oversight, and reviews. Both parties publicly commit to the timeline to program to protections to validate oversight so that the reopening isn't treated as a capitulation or a defeat. Transparent public briefings. The American people deserve to know if the funding bill, what timelines have been agreed, what protections are in place, and Congress must stop hiding behind the procedural maneuvers and speak quickly. Both parties must commit to not letting next year's budget process become another shutdown threat. Consider bipartisan reform. Moving an earlier appropriations reform, the CR stopgap habit, or establishing automatic funding triggers if appropriate lapse. We as citizens must hold a representative accountable, insist on hearings, demand performances, question whether agencies are using funding effectively as not just funding, but as results. In conclusion, the shutdown is a failure to process much as it is a failure of policy. Both parties bear responsibility. Republicans for insisting on funding must reflect the fiscal discipline and the policy priorities. Democrats for insisting the funding must protect social programs and vulnerable Americans and be linked to meaningful policy outcomes. The American people are paying a price in disruptions, uncertainty, and it's an economic drag. But the opportunity remains. Congress can and should reopen the government swiftly. It can use this moment not just to restore the status quo, but to set the stage for a better governance. A budget process that works, policy debates that happen in the daylight, protections for vital programs, and spending oversight that ensures value to the taxpayers. If I may borrow from a waxing of many of public services, let us not let ideology or partisanship override our duty to the American people. Let us remember the government exists for the people, that our institutions, flawed though they may be, are the ones we entrust with the business of running this country. But also recognize that compromise is not a surrender. It is the essence of democracy. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions, reflections, and renewed commitment to carrying the business of the American dream, essentially, out.